Chapter 13, In Northern Taurida. Our success had alarmed the Bolshevists. The Soviet press was sounding the alarm and insisting that the Lord of the Crimea must be suppressed altogether, or at least made to confine himself strictly to the Crimea once again. The Red agents redoubled their activities behind the lines. Lately, there had been a fresh epidemic of unrest amongst the workmen of the port. The workmen had advanced a number of claims, and since these had not been satisfied, they had gone on strike. But by now, the authorities were strong enough to take energetic action. I ordered all the strikers to be disbanded and had those who belonged to the mobilized classes sent to the front immediately. At the same time, I let it be known that, should there be any more trouble, it would be suppressed with the utmost severity. The firmness which the authorities displayed sobered the malcontents. A few dozen turbulent young workmen were sent to the front, and as a result, the rest devoted themselves to their work, in spite of the difficulty of getting raw material, until the end of our occupation of the Crimea. We received good news from the newly occupied territories. The agrarian law was being received very sympathetically. The prikaz concerning the land was read in the local assemblies, and the peasants voiced their approval unmistakably. But at the same time, some regrettable incidents occurred. Many of the local representatives of the central authority, and by no means the least important ones, had no sympathy with the new law, and did what they could to circumvent it by giving it arbitrary interpretations. This tendency had to be checked immediately. Other equally regrettable demonstrations compelled me to issue an order prohibiting the appointment of landowners to administrative posts in their own districts. This prevented the landowner administrators from attempting to turn the situation to their own advantage or to improve their personal relations with the peasants. A state police force was being organized in the newly occupied areas, and the salaries of its members were based on the army standards. There were large reserves of corn in northern Taurida, and harvest time was at hand. Therefore, we would be able to supply the whole of the occupied area and still have a surplus of corn to exchange for other things which we needed. Clothing, ammunition, petrol, oil, and coal were only to be obtained from abroad. Our finances were still in a hopeless condition. Our tiny territory could not feed the army. We had nothing to export except a small quantity of corn and perhaps salt. Local industries were almost non-existent, for the barest essentials were lacking, and nearly everything had to be imported from abroad. Our ruble continued to toll in spite of the increase in taxation. The negotiations which M. Struve had been conducting abroad with a view to raising a loan had come to nothing, for no one really believed that our cause would be successful. The Red troops were following up their success on the Polish front. The Polish army was in rapid retreat. French public opinion, which had been supporting Poland, was obviously very deeply shaken. France showed an increasing interest in our affairs, realizing perfectly well what a priceless boon our victorious offensive had been to their allies the Poles, for whom things had been going so badly. M. Struve, who was in Paris, took very skillful advantage of the situation. He gave a number of lectures on our struggle, telling of our success, emphasizing the new direction of the Supreme Command's policy, and dwelling on the latest agrarian and administrative reforms. The French press reported some of these lectures and commented sympathetically on the broad liberal policy of the South Russian government. M. Struve had a series of interviews with various public men, and finally M. Millerand, president of the French Council, received him. He showed great interest in the struggle in South Russia and asked M. Struve to draw up for him a written account of the regent's point of view on the Russian question. Therefore, on June 7th, 20th, M. Struve sent M. Millerand the following letter. Head of the Diplomatic Department of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Southern Russia. Paris, June 20th, 1920. The Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia has directed me to communicate his ideas and intentions to you, in addition to his views on the present situation in Russia. I have already had occasion to give Your Excellency a verbal account of the principles underlying General Wrangel's internal policy. These principles epitomize the whole of the experience gained from the Russian Revolution and are as follows. I. Seizure by the peasants of land belonging to landed proprietors must be recognized wherever it has taken place. This is to be the basis of wide agricultural reforms which will assure full and complete ownership of the land to the peasants who cultivate it. The peasants' agrarian revolution would thus be legalized and turn to the profit of the new owners of the soil, and an agrarian organization would be set up on the principle of private ownership, which is undoubtedly what the peasants want. The future organization of Russia must be based on an agreement between the existing new separate entities. These various new entities in Russia are at present hostile to one another, but they must unite into one great federation based on an arrangement to which they have all freely consented. This shall be the outcome of their common interests and economic needs. Our policy would in no wise seek to impose union by force. 3. Whatever the future relations of the different parts of Russia, which are now separate entities, may be, the political organization of these countries and the constitution of their federal union must be based on the free expression of public opinion in representative and democratically elected assemblies. Turning to the present situation in war-racked Russia, the British government's present Russian policy is based on the desire to put an end to the civil war before anything else. Britain means by this that the Russian elements under General Wrangel's command, as well as all those who have preserved their independence against the Soviet powers, should surrender to her and to the Red Army. If the British government wants to hasten the end of the Civil War, this is neither an effective nor an honorable means of doing so, for it would force the best elements in the Russian army into an unwilling surrender and put the whole of Russia under the terrorist dictatorship of militant communism incarnate in the Soviet government and its Red Army. On the other hand, if the Civil War be brought to an end by the two parties to the struggle, it would not, under present conditions, take the form of the surrender of the armed forces of South Russia to the Red Army, but of a delimitation between Soviet and anti-Bolshevist Russia, calculated to assure the necessary conditions of life to the territories under both governments. Whatever one's opinion may be as to the possibility of enduring peace between the two governments, the cessation of the Civil War will be an aid to peace only if this plan is adopted. A surrender of one party to the other will be of no avail. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces of South Russia would agree to the termination of the Civil War by some such arrangement as the above, but he cannot possibly consider surrendering to Soviet Russia. Any agreement must guarantee the inviolability of the territory occupied by General Wrangel's army within limits which will ensure the satisfaction of the elementary economic needs of the population, especially in the way of food production. Moreover, the encroachments which the Soviet power have made on Cossack territories must be entirely retracted. General Wrangel has once more acknowledged their historic autonomy and peculiar form of government by an agreement with the atamans who are elected by the Cossacks. General Wrangel thinks that the political entities of Caucasia ought also to be guaranteed against all Soviet aggression. Turning to the question of the resumption of economic relations with Soviet Russia, the belief that such a course of action would exercise a pacific influence on the situation is certainly well-founded. But if it is to succeed, it must be earned out methodically and consistently. This policy of establishing relations between Russia and the rest of the world must be based on two fundamental principles of civilized economic life. A. The law of private property, economic freedom. The application of these principles, even though it be to foreigners only, implies the need for judicial and police organizations to guarantee them. Unless these principles are given effective recognition and put into practice, the resumption of economic relations with Soviet Russia will be but a dead letter. Recognition of private property in the future necessarily implies its recognition in the past, that is to say, it implies recognition by the Soviet powers of all the rights and interests of foreigners in Bolshevist Russia and of all the public debts, state and municipal, previously contracted by the Russian state. Here, I must stress the point that if foreign governments now agree to recognize a Russian government which does not consider itself bound by the financial obligations of the Russian state, all future Russian governments, however moderate and wise they may be, and however clear it may be to them that Russia's best interests demand the respecting of her engagements, will have enormous psychological difficulty in recognizing these debts whose negation has been explicitly or implicitly sanctioned by the governments of the creditor states. I hope that Your Excellency will find this an adequate explanation of the ideas of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia. He considers the above course of action to be his duty, for he is the representative of the elements in the army which have remained loyal to their military honor and alliances, and of a population which recognizes that there are principles of public life which are common to all civilized peoples. General Wrangel realizes the difficulties of his own and of the international situation. He is far from believing that the restoration of order and liberty to Russia can be accomplished by a purely military effort. He understands that hard work after the peace will be essential, and that before anything else, the needs of the peasants must be satisfied, for they form the vast majority of the Russian population. They do not want the restoration of the old order, but neither do they want the communist tyranny. To uphold the interests of the peasant population, to purify the moral life of the country, to reconstruct the economic system, to give order and therefore unity, these are the Commander-in-Chief's aims, and he believes that their realization will lift Russia from the present state of anarchy into which the communist regime has plunged her, making her the victim of monstrous social experiments hitherto unknown to history. Yours faithfully. Whilst France was obviously drawing closer to us, England's policy was still hostile. Lloyd George continued to flirt with the Soviets. The meeting of the Supreme Council of the Allies, which was discussing the proposals to be made to Germany on the subject of reparations, was also dealing with other urgent political questions of the moment. England and France held radically different views on the Russian question. The British government had declared that it was taking no further responsibility for the continuation of the struggle in South Russia, and the English military mission had been recalled. Nothing had been left in the Crimea but a little information bureau. General Percy, the head of the English military mission, had behaved like a perfect gentleman all through the negotiations. When he had heard that England intended to negotiate with the Bolshevists, he had telegraphed to his government that he refused to take part. I knew that in his dispatches he had also urged the impossibility of my countermanding the offensive. I gave a farewell dinner to the mission just before it left. In a few words, I expressed the regret the Russian army felt at parting from its sincere friends, General Percy and the officers of the mission. I said that, politics on one side, Russian and English officers and soldiers were bound together by the blood which they had both shed in the same cause during the Great War, and by the ideals of chivalry and honor dear to every soldier, which were incarnate in the head of the English mission and his officers. This community of feeling had been especially precious to my companions in arms and myself, since the army had been alone in its struggle. General Percy said in reply that he regretted having to leave the army, which was struggling so heroically not only for the Russian cause, but for the whole world. It deserved the highest respect of every impartial spectator. As a soldier, he had nothing to do with politics, but as an English citizen, he hoped that the English people would not abandon their erstwhile ally, the Russian army, in its heroic struggle. He and his officers considered it their duty to bear witness to the gallant exploits of the Russian patriots who were so misunderstood in Europe. After dinner, he told me that he was going to do his utmost to draw the attention of his government to the fatal consequences which would ensue for all Europe if the abandoned Russian army was definitely lost. I am hoping that my government's policy will change, and I have not yet abandoned all hope of returning to you here at the head of another military mission. If this does not come about, there will be nothing for it but to devote myself to my farm, he added, half jestingly. I attached no importance to his last remark, but a few months later, I received a letter from him. He wrote that, since he was convinced of the disastrous character of his government's present policy, he had left its service and refused the divisional post that had been offered him. He had gone to Canada, where he intended to devote himself to his farm. Later on, my English friends confirmed these facts. In the meantime, we had received news that Comrade Jaloba's cavalry troop was drawing near to our front on the eastern side. The Army Corps units came up from Caucasia by rail and detrained at Volnovaka, Rozovka, and Sarajevo-Konstantinovka stations. I decided not to allow the enemy to complete their concentration, but to wrest the initiative from them. I gave the troops orders accordingly. On June 15th, the enemy launched a vigorous offensive against the Don Army Corps. They were a cavalry division and a half strong and were supported by cars and armored trains. After heavy fighting with the rearguard, the Don troops retreated. The Second Army Corps undertook an offensive to ease the situation, but found difficulty in advancing. On June 16th, the Reds attempted to cross the Dnieper, but were driven back to the right bank after a short struggle. On the afternoon of the 17th, they again tried to force a passage at Kardashinka, but were again repulsed, losing prisoners and machine guns. From the 17th until the 19th, the Don troops continued to retreat and Jaloba's cavalry to advance towards the southwest. Jaloba avoided daytime marches and went forward only by night, for he had suffered heavy losses from our aeroplanes. Meanwhile, the struggle was still going on along the front where the Second Corps was stationed. Thus, General Slakchov was not in a position to be of any assistance to the Don troops, who were exhausted by fighting. However, on June 17th, the Second Corps won a definite success. General Slakchov's troops attacked the enemy and inflicted a severe defeat on them. On the 19th, our troops at last succeeded in occupying the positions which had been assigned to them for this operation. Our fighting force numbered 10 to 11,000 bayonets and sabers altogether, whilst the approximate number of our troops at the front totaled 15,000 bayonets and 6,500 sabers. Jaloba's principal cavalry troops with which the enemy were attacking us numbered 7,500 cavalry and 6,000 infantry. The 13th Soviet Army's total figure was 25,000 bayonets and 10,000 cavalry. At 6 o'clock in the evening of June 19th, I gave the following directions. To General Abramov, leave a covering detachment, and before dawn on June 20th, attack the enemy in the south with your principal forces and try to surround their left wing. To General Kutapov, first carry out the necessary regrouping, then, before the dawn of June 20th, strike a decisive blow on the north and northeast against the right flank and rear of the enemy. To General Slakchov, hold the enemy in check on your front. The directions ended with the following warning. The success of this operation depends upon its secrecy, for it must be completely unexpected when it does come, as well as upon the well-concerted action of the troops. I telephoned instructions to the commander of each Army Corps. At dawn, there was a skirmish on the front where the Don troops were stationed. The Cossacks' offensive had clinched with the Red offensive. I wired to the Don troops to hold out, cost what it might, in order to give the 1st Army Corps a chance to turn the enemy's flank and rear. I thanked the Don Cossacks for their recent gallantry and expressed my belief that they would do their duty. The booming of the guns could be heard distinctly at Melitopol station. Groups of citizens laden with their belongings had gathered nearby and were asking if it was not time to leave the town. The general staff was proceeding with its work as usual, but even their nerves were at very high tension. I still had a reserve force, the regiment composed of pupils from the military schools. They were posted at Voznesenskoye, covering Melitopol. At midday, the tension reached its height. The several Army Corps were in action, and we were not in direct communication with them. The barrage became louder and more distinct. At last, the whirring of a screw. An aeroplane flew over the train at a low altitude and sent a rocket up and a dispatch down. The enemy was absolutely beaten and hemmed in by our troops. General Kachov announced the complete downfall of the enemy. The 1st Army Corps had attacked after a rapid march. Our artillery had been stationed in the open country, and had opened fire on the Red troops who were attacking the Don Army Corps. Our armored cars had broken through the ranks of Jaloba's cavalry and fired point-blank on the Reds, and simultaneously a squadron of aeroplanes had deluged the Red cavalry with a rain of machine gun fire. Comrade, Jaloba had stopped the offensive against the Don troops and launched all his forces, nearly 5 cavalry brigades, against the 1st Army Corps. But our troops had received the Red cavalry attack with rifle fire, reinforced by shells and machine gun fire. Our artillery had taken up an exposed position and opened fire on the enemy's flank, and at the same time, the Don troops, who had recovered very quickly, had made a dash northward. Attacked in front and on their flank, and overwhelmed by the machine gun fire from our squadron of aeroplanes, the massive Red cavalry had been thrown into confusion and had taken to flight in all directions. The biggest detachment, with Jaloba himself at its head, had made for the north, where the reserves of the 2nd Army Corps and the armored cars had met them and fired point-blank on the disordered mobs. Jaloba had fallen back towards the south, but there again had come beneath the scourge of the 1st Army Corps, whose troops were pursuing the enemy in wagons, barring their path, and sprinkling it with machine gun fire. Our cavalry had come up with the remnants of the Red divisions and had finally dispersed them. A second group of Red cavalry had been hurried northwards, but colliding with the troops of the 1st Army Corps, they had been greeted with a murderous fire, so had fallen back towards the east, only to meet with the Don troops. Our advance guard cavalry had pursued the fragments of the defeated enemy troops for a long time, the Reds putting up no resistance. Many of them had abandoned their weary horses and lay hidden in the hamlets or ravines. Comrade, Loba's cavalry troop was wiped out. The enemy's whole artillery force, nearly 40 big guns and 200 machine guns, as well as 2,000 prisoners, fell into our hands. We also took 3,000 horses, and the regiments of the 2nd Cavalry Division and the Don were remounted with them. We took prisoner the general staffs of 2 Red cavalry divisions. On June 19th and 20th, the Reds had again attempted the passage of the Dnieper and had actually seized 1 or 2 positions, but they were repulsed with heavy losses almost immediately. At the same time, General Slachchov's Army Corps was repulsing fierce attacks from the Reds. Then our troops took up the offensive all along the front. On June 23rd, the enemy began a general retreat. The operations near Orakov and Alexandrovsk on June 10th and 23rd had given us 3,000 more prisoners and many trophies. Altogether, between June 15th and the 23rd, during which period the 10th really big operation of the Russian army had taken place, we had taken more than 11,000 prisoners, 60 big guns, 300 machine guns, 2 armored cars, and a huge collection of firearms and bayonets. The Red Command's scheme for purging Northern Taurida of the Russian army had proved a complete fiasco. I took advantage of the lull at the front and went to inspect the Don Army Corps. The regiments had all been remounted and had been able to re-equip themselves adequately from the enormous stock of horses, saddles, and arms taken from Jaloba's cavalry troop. Only a few days previously, the Cossacks, who were unused to fighting on foot, had given a very poor performance in battle, but now the Cossack cavalry had become a force to be reckoned with once more. As I watched the orderly movements of the Cossack ranks marching past me, I felt that this magnificent resurrection of Russia's cavalry must be a dream. The mobilization which I had ordered was being carried out successfully. 5 weeks of incessant and heavy fighting had put large numbers of men out of action. The ranks of the army were melting away, and the reinforcements could not make up for all the losses. New sources of recruitment had to be found. A certain number of soldiers and officers could still be brought up from behind the lines by dint of hard work. General staffs and numerous military administrations had been gradually suppressed. In the last 2 months, no fewer than 3 bundled and 60 institutions had been wound up. Notwithstanding this, I hope to reduce them still further by another 150 at least. A series of orders emanating from the civil and military administration commanded the immediate transference to the front of all able-bodied soldiers employed behind the lines, Their positions were to be given to men unfit for active service. An exception was made for specialists of all kinds and for chiefs of sections and their superiors. The Comptroller General was to check off the numbers of effectives in the different military formations and cut down the soldiers' rations to the minimum. Nevertheless, in spite of all these precautions, the proportion between the number of combatants and the number of mouths which the commissariat had to feed was still 1 to 5. The enormous number of wounded and prisoners, as well as considerable numbers of evacuated inhabitants who had returned, mostly old men and invalids of one kind or another, all added to the number of mouths to be fed behind the lines. Only a very small number of the unfit were still useful as reinforcements for the reserve regiments, which acted as military instructors to the new recruits and some of the prisoners, from whose ranks we always drew a large number of recruits. In most cases, the commanders of the units and the divisional chiefs would make the first selection from amongst their prisoners and use them partly for service behind the lines and partly for active service. The rest of the prisoners would be consigned to concentration camps under the supervision of counter-espionage agents. The communists would be eliminated, and the rest drafted into the reserve regiments. But even so, all these sources of recruitment could not make up for our losses, especially amongst the officers. We had to find still further sources. Find them we did in the remnants of the armies of the Northwest and the North, and also amongst General Schilling's troops, which had withdrawn into Poland under General Bredov's command and had been interned there. I ordered all our military representatives to do their utmost to send able-bodied soldiers and officers to the Crimea. Negotiations with Poland and Romania on the subject of the return of General Bredov's detachment were proceeding satisfactorily. The area which we had just occupied was rich in horses. Therefore, we were able to mount the regular cavalry regiments and the Kubanian Cossacks and horse part of the artillery. Nevertheless, we still lacked horses for our transport, and I was compelled to order a supplementary mobilization of 3,000 horses. It was especially difficult for the population to furnish such a large number, as field work was in full swing. I was anxious to lighten the burden for the population as much as I possibly could. To this end, I ordered the troops to assist with the harvest work and the winter sowing of corn. Men who were free at the time were to help, and the transport horses were to be used. Those chiefs of the civil administration who were in closest touch with the Army Corps were to collect information concerning the number of horses and vehicles necessary for gathering in the harvest. Thereupon, the Army Corps commanders were to give the necessary instructions. The commanders of the units were to be responsible for their execution, whilst the divisional and Army Corps chiefs were to supervise. Every Army Corps was to send me a weekly report of what had been done. I warned the troops that I should hold the chief of a unit responsible if I found that the harvest had not been gathered in from the fields near which his unit was stationed. In view of the enemy's enormous numerical superiority, technical aids to warfare, such as aeroplanes, tanks, and armored cars, acquired particular importance for us. In the recent engagements, our aeroplanes had rendered us inestimable service, but all the machines, 20 or 30 of them altogether, were in such a state of disrepair that they would be unfit for use for a month or 6 weeks to come. The tanks and armored cars were in a similar ramshackle condition, and it was a tribute to the courageous doggedness of our officers that they were still in use at all. Petrol, oil, and rubber were only to be obtained from abroad, and that only with the greatest difficulty. We felt the shortage very severely indeed. We bought all our necessaries in Romania, Bulgaria, and Georgia. Our attempts to utilize the Russian stocks in Trebizond were fruitless. The difficulties were insurmountable. England put all kinds of obstacles in our way and held up our cargoes on 1,001 pretexts. By using all kinds of expedients and working on the goodwill of the British representatives in Constantinople, we managed to avoid these obstacles. But we squandered a great deal of time and effort. There was also a much more serious difficulty. We had not the necessary foreign currency for our purchases. Our financial situation was growing steadily worse. Our small reserves of foreign money were melting away, and we were not receiving any more. Our ruble was still falling. Corn was our sole exportable commodity, and our only way of ensuring the re-equipment of the army with war material was to exchange corn for ammunition. The idea of a monopoly in the export of corn had to be very seriously considered. Such a measure would inevitably provoke discontent in certain commercial circles whose first care was personal profit, but from the national point of view, no other course was possible. Northern Taurida gradually became more settled, and the Zemstvo resumed its work. The whole of its complex machinery had been disorganized and had to be built up again from the very beginning. The lack of men had become serious. Already it was rare to find experienced officers in the regiments. Penury was still very widespread in the civil administration. In my predecessor's time, the administration had been overrun with a personnel which had been chosen at random. Later, when the armed forces of South Russia had collapsed, a large number of these officials had left the country, and the only ones still left in most branches of the administration were those who had been unable to go abroad for some reason or another, and those who had a family and therefore were obliged to go on drudging, whatever the penalty. Almost without exception, they were all 20th men. Under such conditions, it was difficult to demand creative work from them. Since the beginning of his activities as my adjutant and president of my council, M. Krivochain had addressed a large number of people, urging them to work. But nobody could bring himself to devote his energy to a cause which was, in the opinion of everyone, hopeless. Most of them refused, on some pretext or another. Some pleaded reasons of health, others urged personal reasons, others again declared that they had lost faith in the cause, and in themselves too. In his interviews with me, M. Krivochain complained bitterly of the conditions under which he was made to work. "Nobody gives me any help," he said. "I have to bother about all kinds of peccadillos." He worked 12 hours a day, but never lost heart. Our recent victories had reassured him considerably. "Everything depends on our continued success," he said. "If we increase our territory and seize the oil and petrol areas of Caucasia, foreigners will support us. We shall have money, and then we shall be able to obtain all we want." We discussed the present situation at great length, seeking a way out. The little Crimea could not continue to feed an army for very much longer. Our base was too small, and we could not possibly undertake widespread operations against the Soviet armies from it. It was necessary to enlarge our base and seize new areas rich in natural wealth, which could give us new sources of re-equipment and ensure foreign credit. But before we could enlarge our territory, we had to increase the size of our army, and this seemed an impossible task in view of our lack of technical equipment, arms, and ammunition. Thus, it seemed to be a vicious circle. The Poles were retreating all along the front. During the last few days, their retreat had degenerated into a disorderly flight. It was already possible for the Red Command to detach troops from the Polish front and send them south. Just lately, we had noticed many new divisions on our front. They had come up from the west. In a very short time, the Reds would be finished with the Poles and would be able to launch all their forces against us. The only possible source of recruitment still open to us was the Cossack territories. When General Denikin's armies had dispersed, tens of thousands of Cossacks had returned to their native villages, taking with them horses, arms, and ammunition. Enormous stocks of ammunition had been abandoned in northern Caucasia and the Don. In spite of the bloody warfare, which had been raging in the Don and Caucasia for so many years, these districts were still rich in natural resources. Everything seemed to point to our carrying the struggle into Cossack territory. The information which we received from our intelligence service in the Kuban and the Don seemed favorable. In many villages, the Cossacks had revolted against the Soviet power. The population hid our scouts and supported them whenever they had the opportunity. It is true that we also learnt of the measures which the Red Command had taken to disarm the population. Many of the Cossacks had been deported to Central Russia. The campaign, which was to enlarge our base by extending it to Cossack territories, could only succeed if it were supported by local bodies, as our troops arrived. there would have to be a general rising of the population. We could not spare very considerable forces for this campaign, for the defense of our granary, Northern Taurida, was a matter of life and death for us. We would only be able to recall the troops to the Crimean Isthmus later on. When and if we won great initial successes and conquered the fertile districts of northern Caucasia, then we could fortify our position and throw the greater part of our troops towards the east to consolidate and develop the successes already won there. After deep reflection, I adopted the following plan. When the army had been reorganized and order had been restored behind the lines, we must strike out at the enemy on the northern front and so free our hands. Then, whilst maintaining ourselves in Northern Taurida, we must detach a section of our forces, the Caucasian Cossack regiments, and send them to the Kuban, relying on the support of the Cossacks of that area, and sweep the whole of the Kuban free of the Bolshevists. Later still, we must abandon Northern Taurida, leaving the defense of the Isthmus to the 1st Army Corps, and send the Don troops to help those in the Kuban. Since we were contemplating a campaign to free the Cossack districts from the Red Yoke, the Cossack question had to be settled once and for all. The relations between the South Russian government and the Cossack government had to be defined. I thought it desirable to preserve a wide autonomy which could work through the existing machinery of local Cossack administration. Yet at the same time, I felt that I ought, in the interests of the cause, to keep the essential weapons of national power in my own hands, weapons such as the departments for the army, finance, communications, the postal service, and the telegraph. The situation was favorable for an agreement with the Cossacks. Separatist tendencies had lost credit amongst them, whilst the Cossacks at the front were frankly hostile to separatism. The Atamans and their governments felt that the troops at the front distrusted them and found themselves in complete dependence on the South Russian government. Therefore, they did their utmost to effect a reconciliation with the Supreme Command. The press, except for the official paper, the Velikaya Rossiya, gave a very imperfect impression of the impotence of our national struggle and the South Russian government's point of view on internal and foreign questions. Quite often, whether consciously or unconsciously, through the fault of the editor or merely simple carelessness, or perhaps because of the incompetence of the censor, the press published news paragraphs or articles which produced the most unfortunate impression abroad. A paper with monarchist leanings, the Russkaya Pravda, which appeared in Sebastopol, published a series of articles wrongly advocating pogroms. Admiral McCully, the American representative, and Major Etievant, who was representing France now instead of General Mangin, he was equally well disposed towards us, came to me one after the other, each with copies of this paper in his hand, and warned me that the articles they had marked would produce a very bad impression on public opinion in their country. I immediately gave an order censuring the censor and suspending the paper. In view of the complicated political situation and the preponderance of democratic tendencies in the Western countries on whom we were absolutely dependent, we had to be particularly circumspect. Emigrant Russian circles, who were hostile to us, were carrying on a treacherous campaign and deceiving democratic Europe. They wished it to be thought that we were not fighting for the national cause, but for nationalist tendencies, and that not liberation, but restoration was our object. They made capital out of every possible event, the word master printed in large type in my appeal to the Russian people on the eve of the offensive had raised a tempest in the press of the left. Unfortunately, such papers as the Russkaya Pravda gave them many a pretext. On July 5th, an interview which I had given to one of their reporters appeared in the Velikaya Rossiya. It read rather like a declaration. "Why are we fighting?" "There can be only one answer to this question," said General Wrangel. "We are fighting for freedom." On the other side of the Northern Front despotism, oppression and slavery reigned supreme. One can have the most varied opinion as to the opportuneness of such and such a regime. One may be Republican, radical, socialist, or even Marxist, and still realize that the so-called Soviet Republic is nothing but the expression of an unprecedented, sinister despotism, which is sending Russia into a decline. Even the so-called governing class, the proletariat, are oppressed as much as the rest of the population. Europe no longer regards it as a mystery. The veil has been torn from the face of Soviet Russia. Moscow is the heart and center of the reaction, for there live the tyrants who treat the people like beasts. As for ourselves, anyone who treats us as reactionaries must be either blind or dishonest. We are fighting to free our people from a bondage such as they have never experienced before, even in the darkest epochs of their history. For a long time, Europe did not understand this, but it seems that she is just beginning to understand what we realize so clearly: the worldwide significance of our civil war. If our sacrifices are to prove in vain, European society, European democracy, will be forced to take up arms to defend its cultural and political possessions against an enemy who is drunk with success. The master. The word master has made its fortune. It is in ready circulation. But Russia at this moment has no master. I do not regard myself in this light at all, and want to say so in an unmistakable manner. But neither can I see Russia's master in the Sovnarkom usurper, that creature who has submerged Russia in anarchy. The master is none other than the Russian people themselves, and the state will take any form they wish. If they want a king, Russia will be a monarchy. If they think a republic will be most useful to them, we shall have a republic. But give the people an opportunity to voice their opinion free from the Cheka and out of range of machine guns. The Bolshevists have dissolved the Constituent Assembly and imprisoned or even assassinated many of its members. They dread any form of lawful representation capable of voicing the will of the people. But we, on the contrary, want to establish a modicum of order so that the people may, if they so desire it, meet together and freely voice their opinion. My personal inclinations count for nothing. From the moment when I accepted my present position, I repudiated all my own ideas on the question of government and subjected myself absolutely to the will of the Russian people. The Jewish question. I asked General Wrangel's opinion on the Jewish question. A recrudescence of animosity against the Jews is indeed apparent amongst the people, he said. Feeling is running very high indeed, especially amongst the masses, and is turning rapidly against the source of Bolshevist infection. The people do not single out the culprits. They see Jewish commissars and Jewish communists, and do not stop to realize that they form only a part of the Jewish population, and have perhaps broken with the other part who do not share their communist views nor accept the Soviet power. I believe that anything tending to lead to a pogrom, and all propaganda in this direction, is a misfortune for the state, and I will oppose such things by every means in my power. All pogroms demoralize the army. The troops who take part in them become absolutely undisciplined. In the morning they attack the Jews, in the evening they pillage others. The Jewish question is an age-old, miserable, difficult problem. It can only be solved by time and social legislation, and then only if this is promulgated by a strong power relying on law and supported by real force. In a land where anarchy and despotism reign supreme, where the inviolability of person and property is trampled underfoot, the way is open for one part of the population to perpetuate every kind of violence against another. The revival of anti-Semitism amongst the people is perhaps a sign of their loathing for communism, with which they quite mistakenly identify all the Jews. The recrudescence of Bolshevist activity in any country in the world will bring similar anti-Semitic tendencies in its train. Russia and Europe. I am longing for the end of the Civil War with all my soul. Every drop of Russian blood which is shed wrings my heart. But the struggle must go on until men's consciences awake and they realize that they are fighting against themselves and their liberty, and that they are committing a senseless act of political suicide. Until there is a normal power established in Russia, no matter what its complexion, so long as it is based on those principles which centuries of human thought have hallowed: legality, respect for personal rights and for private property, and the inviolability of international engagements, Europe will see neither peace nor any amelioration of economic conditions. No international treaty, however unstable, can be concluded, nor any question definitely settled. One day history will appreciate the self-abnegation and the labors of a handful of Russians in the Crimea who gave up everything and strove for the good of humanity and the distant centers of European culture on this last strip of Russian territory. The Russian army in the Crimea stands for a great liberating movement. It is a holy war for freedom and justice. The Bolshevist success on the Polish front had considerably strengthened the position of the Soviet government in London. England was bringing strong pressure to bear on the Poles to induce them to sign the peace. Italy was also inclined for an entente with the Soviets. France and America alone remained faithful to their former policy. The preliminary condition on which the French government insisted before it would enter into any negotiations with the Bolshevists with a view to an alliance was that the Bolshevists should recognize all the obligations of former Russian governments. Lloyd George was ready to come to terms even on this point. France therefore abstained from taking part in the negotiations, and the English government sent a note to the Soviets advising them to conclude an armistice with the Poles and refer the question of the Russo-Polish frontier to the Allies. Should this plan be adopted, the Polish troops were to withdraw at once to the line which the peace conference had fixed a year previously, that is, the Brest-Litovsk line, which had been fixed as the boundary of incontestably Polish territory. The Bolshevists were not to pass beyond a line 50 kilometers to the east of this. Should an armistice be arranged, England proposed to call a peace conference in London at the beginning of August. Besides Poland, Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, and Eastern Galicia were to take part, and all were to be given this opportunity to affirm their independence. If the Bolshevists accepted this proposition, the English Prime Minister promised to allow them an absolutely free choice of their representatives for the conference. M. Gears, who informed us of all this, telegraphed, "They want to extend this armistice to Wrangel's front and make him withdraw to the Isthmus of Perekop." On July 7th, I instructed M. Neratov to telegraph to M. Struve. To demand the withdrawal of our troops to the Isthmus is to condemn the army and the population to death by famine, for the peninsula cannot feed them. Chicherin answered Lloyd George's armistice proposal by saying that he would reject English mediation between Poland and the Soviets, or on the question of the Soviets' relations with the rebel Wrangel, to whom he could promise nothing but his life should he capitulate. Force of circumstances compelled the new Polish coalition cabinet under the presidency of the peasant Witos to negotiate an armistice directly with the Soviets. I strove to hasten General Makrov's departure for Poland by every means in my power. At last, after a whole month of negotiation, we obtained the consent of the Polish government to his appointment as our military representative at Warsaw, and he set off for Constantinople on board an American destroyer. On the evening of the 8th, I went back to Jankoy. The next day, M. Krivochin telephoned me. "A telegram has just come from M. Struve," he said. "The French government has consented to a de facto recognition of the South. Russian government. It is a great political victory." Yes, it was indeed a great triumph for our foreign policy. It was the crowning point of 3 months' work. M. Gears had telegraphed on July 7th. "Struve begs to inform General Wrangel that M. Milleran summoned him today and told him that he would agree to recognize the government of the armed forces of South Russia as a de facto government on the following conditions. 1. That we recognize explicitly all the financial obligations of the old Russian government, which touch that part of Russia now occupied by our armies. 2. That we recognize the division of the land amongst the peasants which took place during the Resolution, and confirm the peasants in this land in individual ownership. 3. That we promise to call a popular assembly elected on a democratic basis at the first suitable moment. This declaration must be put in the form of a request for de facto recognition addressed to M. Millerand, President of the Council of the French Republic. Struve strongly advocates the immediate acceptance of M. Millerand's offer, because de facto recognition by France will be an immense step forward in the consolidation of our international position and will greatly facilitate re-equipment. We ought to recognize the entire Russian debt, and not merely that part of it which which applies to the territory which we are occupying. Because, as Struve pointed out to Ms. Millerand, we look upon ourselves as the representatives of the national idea and of the whole Russian state. He has agreed to this interpretation. M. Millerand's communication is strictly confidential. 2 days later, on July 9, 22nd, Gears telegraphed. Struve begs to inform General Wrangel of the text, as reported in the official newspaper, of President Millerand's speech to the Chamber of Deputies on July 20th. Let me describe the position of General Wrangel, who is struggling so bravely and successfully against Bolshevism in the Crimea and Taurida. At the moment, circumstances are favoring him. A real de facto government has been set up and has won the support and sympathies of the population by enforcing the agrarian reform of dividing the land between the peasants. Furthermore, at this very moment, it is drafting a scheme for calling a popular representative assembly. When this de facto government asks for recognition, it is quite understood that a preliminary condition will be its unanimous and responsible declaration that it accepts all the obligations contracted by previous Russian governments with foreign states. I instructed Prince Trubetskoy to telegraph to Struve. Authorize Gears to make the required declaration to M. Millerand in the form that you consider best. It is desirable to emphasize that whilst we, as upholders of the national idea and the traditions of the Russian state, accept all the obligations of former Russian governments, we expect that out-corresponding rights will also be recognized. Concerning the agrarian question, the prikaz concerning the land, issued by the Commander-in-Chief on May 25th, gives the land back to the peasants in full ownership. That is to say, we have already complied with one of the conditions in advance. Furthermore, the Commander-in-Chief authorizes you to say that in full accordance with his earlier declarations, he considers his principal task to be the creation of a situation which will make it possible for the people to voice their opinion freely on the essential problems of the form of government which is to be established as soon as circumstances permit. With this aim in view, the prikaz of July 15th has already put local administration into the hands of the district zemstvos, which are elected on a democratic basis. Please convey to M. Millerand the Commander-in-Chief's sincere gratitude for his friendly references to us. The support which the French government is giving the national cause in Russia in these difficult times is of a piece with the traditional friendship of the two allied powers, and undoubtedly reestablishes their close union for the future, based as it is on their mutual interests and political aims. Meanwhile, the enemy were still reinforcing their effectives and sending new units to our front from eastern Russia, western Siberia, Caucasia, and the Polish front. On the northern section of our front, the enemy's forces numbered 11 infantry and 6 cavalry divisions, 35,000 bayonets and 10,000 sabers in all. The total number of men in the enemy's army had grown to 250 to 300,000, counting both those at the front and behind the lines. I ordered my troops to attack the Reds and thus prevent them from completing their concentration and resuming the initiative. From July 12th to July 20th, fighting had been in progress all along the front, with varying success. It was not until the 18th that we definitely gained the upper hand. By the 20th, the enemy were already in full retreat, and we had taken more than 5,000 prisoners, 30 big guns, 150 machine guns, 4 armored trains, and quantities of war material. On July 22nd, the following convention was solemnly signed between ourselves and the Ottomans of the Don, Terek, Kuban, and Astrakhan. In view of their joint undertaking to free Russia from the yoke of Bolshevism, the Regent and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia and the Atamans and governments of the Don, Kuban, Terek, and Astrakhan have unanimously concluded the following convention as an elaboration of their agreement of April 15th of this year. 1. Complete independence in home affairs and administration is guaranteed to the states of the Don, Kuban, Terek, and Astrakhan. 2. The presidents of the governments of the Don, Kuban, Terek, and Astrakhan, or their deputies, shall sit in the Regent's Ministerial Council and have the right to vote. 3. The Commander-in-Chief shall assume plenary powers over all the armed forces of the Don, Kuban, Terek, and Astrakhan for military operations and all questions of army organization. The states of the Don, Kuban, Terek, and Astrakhan shall order a mobilization of those classes which have already been mobilized on the territory occupied by the armed forces of South Russia, as the Commander-in-Chief shall direct. 4. Everything necessary for the re-equipment of the armed forces of South Russia in their struggle against the Bolshevists shall, upon an order from the Commander-in-Chief, be supplied by the territories occupied by the armed forces and the states of the Don, Kuban, Terek, and Astrakhan. The share expected from each will be settled in advance. 5. The administration of the railways and the principal telegraph lines shall be in the hands of the Commander-in-Chief. 6. Arrangements and negotiations with foreign governments on political and economic questions shall come within the province of the Regent and Commander-in-Chief. In cases where such negotiations affect the interests of one of the 4 Cossack states, the Regent and Commander-in-Chief shall first consult with the Ataman of that state. 7. A tariff and a common indirect tax shall be established. All barriers and visits by customs officials are abolished between the parties to this convention. 8. One currency only shall be in circulation throughout the territories off the contracting parties. The Regent and Commander-in-Chief shall exercise the right of issuing it. The elaboration of the monetary system and the division of the money as it is minted are reserved for a later convention. The standard for the new currency is to be settled by the Regent's Ministerial Council, with which it is compulsory that representatives of the states of the Don, Kuban, Terek, and Astrakhan shall cooperate. The Regent and Commander-in-Chief shall ratify the scheme. 9. When the territories of the states of the Don, Kuban, Terek, and Astrakhan are freed, this convention shall be put before the Cossack Representative Assembly and the local Radas for ratification, but it shall come into force immediately as it is signed. It is to remain in force until the civil war is definitely over. It became more and more obvious that the negotiations between the Poles and the Bolshevists would come to nothing. The Soviet powers kept putting off the conclusion of the negotiations on all manner of pretexts, apparently wishing to gain time for the Red troops who were advancing victoriously so that they could defeat their enemy at leisure. It is true that Lloyd George was still making desperate efforts to arrange a compromise with the Soviets, but even he seemed to realize the hopelessness of his attempts. In one of his speeches in the House of Commons, he declared that England had done her utmost to prevent the need for resorting to extreme measures arising. French policy was unchanged. France was preparing to support Poland by every means in her power and was sending out military instructors, arms, and ammunition. As for America, she had squarely refused to enter into any negotiations whatsoever with the Bolshevists. The day when Europe would open her eyes and realize the world danger of the Red International seemed to be approaching. We had another telegram from M. Gears on July 22nd, August 4th. He wrote, "In view of the urgency of the situation and the turn which the armistice question has taken, General Miller has begun negotiations with the French military authorities and will report the results directly to you." Gears. It was clear that the rupture was complete and that henceforth all questions would have to be settled by force of arms and not by diplomatic notes. General Chatalov and I were sitting on the terrace of the palace one clear, peaceful evening. The sunset was already fading, and all the colors of the rainbow were mirrored in the sea. As twilight crept upon the town, the street lamps began to twinkle. We had often sat upon this terrace for hours, exchanging ideas and discussing the future, or talking of the part, but we seldom, if ever, revealed our most intimate thoughts to one another. In these difficult days, when it seemed that there was no way out, we had tacitly agreed to spare one another's feelings. We spoke only of the immediate facts of the situation, or of practical questions. It was only when we spoke of the past that we mutually confessed the doubts and mental anguish which until now we had kept zealously hidden in the very depths of our beings. On this particular evening, we talked more intimately and sincerely than usual. All the circumstances combined to put us in the mood for intimate outpourings. The serene loveliness of the dying day, the temporary lull after months of bloody warfare, and the rift which seemed to be opening in the black clouds which had enveloped our external situation on all sides. Yes, mused Chatteloff pensively, you and I cannot sufficiently appreciate the miracle in which we have been both onlookers and actors. It is now 3 months since we came here. You believed that your duty called you here to the army. I came because I could not leave you. I do not know if you thought that success was possible. I know I considered that everything was absolutely lost. It is only 3 months ago. He paused. Yes, an immense amount of work has been done in that time, he continued, and it has not been done in vain. Whatever the future may hold for us, the honor of the national flag, which was trailed in the dust at Novorossiysk, has now been redeemed, and this heroic struggle will fail, if indeed it does fail, in a blaze of beauty. And yet the failure of our struggle is no longer a foregone conclusion. Just as 3 months ago I was convinced that our cause was lost, today I am equally convinced that we shall succeed. The army has achieved a new birth, and although it is small in numbers, its spirit has never been stronger. I do not doubt the success of the Kuban campaign. The army will increase its numerical strength in this area as well as in the Don. The population is on our side now. They have faith in the new regime and realize that it is fighting to free Russia and not to punish her. Europe herself understands that we are fighting for a cause which is not merely Russian, but European. No, the failure of our cause is not to be thought of now. I listened in silence while my friend and brother-in-arms was talking. An enormous amount of work had indeed been accomplished. 3 months ago, the army had been driven down to the sea and had been on the point of extinction on the last strip of native soil. The people of Russia had disowned it, seeing it only as an oppressor, not as a liberator. Europe had turned her back on us and had been ready to regard the usurpers who had seized Russia as a power representing the Russian people. The end had seemed imminent and inevitable, but behold, our troops had gone forward and triumphed, their souls purged by suffering. They had marched on, spreading order and a spirit of lawfulness wherever they went. The new regime had the confidence of the people. Its face had been unveiled for all to see. The world, which had been on the point of forgetting us, was already beginning to understand us, and the struggle of a handful of Russian patriots was becoming an important factor in international politics. Yes, this was all true enough, but how small was this scrap of free Russia compared with the vast Russian territories in the power of the Reds? How poverty-stricken we seemed compared with those who had pilfered our country of all its great wealth. How unequal were the two parties in territory, strength, and resources. Our ranks grew thinner daily. Behind the lines were crowds of wounded. Our best and most experienced officers were out of action, and there were none to take their place. Our weapons were wearing out, and our stock of ammunition was dwindling. Our technical engines of war were becoming useless, and without them we were powerless. Buy more? We had not the necessary means at our disposal. Our economic position was growing more and more difficult. Had we the strength to hold out until help should come? And another thing, was help coming? Would not those who were willing to send it demand too high a price in return? For we could not expect any entirely disinterested help. It would be useless to look for high moral considerations behind Europe's policy, for it was inspired solely by a desire for gain. I have my proofs to hand. Only a few days before this, I had let it be known that, to stop contraband of war from being smuggled into the Black Sea ports, I had ordered mines to be laid at the entrance to the Soviet harbors. The commanders of the Allied fleets, both English and French, had protested against this measure and had telegraphed to me that it was superfluous because they themselves had forbidden all traffic with the Soviet ports. 4 days later, the wireless station at our Marine Department intercepted a wireless message from the French torpedo boat Commandant Borix, which had been sent, it seemed, at the request of the Cooperative Union of Odessa. It ran as follows. The ship, its name was indecipherable, leaves for Genoa on August 5th with 4,000 tons of corn. Send the ship back with drugs, apparatus for shipment, and surgical instruments. Signed, Doni. What guarantee had we that those who needed us at this particular time would not abandon us at the critical moment? Had we the time to become strong enough to be able to continue the struggle with only our own forces, if need be, when this moment came? The future was still uncertain, and it was better not to investigate it too closely. We had no choice. We had to go on fighting as long as we had the strength.